Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
It's that time of the year again. You know what this month is.
Poetry!
Yes, it's National Poetry Month. Every year the library has a big celebration of poetry. We have a poetry contest currently running, April 2021. If you submit a poem to the library, we have prizes. We'll pick poems based on the different age categories or grades of the people that contribute poems. So there's winners in every age category. So this is the month and everybody in America turns to thoughts of poetry.
They do. I've already taken calls with inquiries.
Excellent.
Yep.
The whole purpose of this is to get people excited about poetry again, which is hard sometimes, as kids are often taught wrong things about poetry, or they just believe, wrong things. I love poetry, but I'm not an expert. I'm going to talk as if I know what I'm talking about for the next couple of episodes, but I've never been formally trained in any of this. I don't have an English degree. My relationship with poetry is in a lot of ways a very personal one because I was a poet for many years, and I still write poetry occasionally. I was a performance poet. So it's possible my viewpoint is colored by the fact that everything I've done has been mostly in front of audiences,
Right.
rather than writing things for literary journals and publishing them and things like that. So I'll try not to skew my views too much in my personal tastes, but it may still happen. So to talk about poetry, we should start with what is poetry. I tried to find an easy definition, and of course there is no real definition of poetry.
I'd say it's a written expression of your soul.
That's a good way of putting it. I've said before that poetry is something that comes from one person's heart directly into another person's heart. Communication that sometimes bypasses the brain. You don't have to understand a poem to feel very strongly about it. It can make you feel an emotion even if you don't understand it. You said written.
Or spoken.
Or spoken, exactly. Most of the definitions that I found said that it's a literature in which, and I'm like, I don't like that because I don't consider poetry a form of literature.
Right.
It doesn't have to be. I cobbled together from several different internet sources a definition. Poetry is communication based on the interplay of words and rhythm, usually involving rhyme and meter, which is a pretty good way of putting it. You don't have to have rhyme or meter. You should have a really great poem, but you don't have to. And I like the fact that definition uses the word interplay of words and rhythm, which is exactly what poetry is all about. We all know what a rhyme is, words that have similar sounding endings. Meter is a similar word for rhythm. Technically, meter and rhythm have different definitions, but I use them interchangeably. Meter comes from a Greek word which means to measure. So the meter of a piece is literally the measure of it. And poetry, by the way, comes from a Greek word that means to create. So poetry is a verb, not a noun.
Interesting.
Poetry is literally the act of creation to the ancient Greeks.
So when we say meter in regard, what are we actually measuring?
You're measuring the pauses in something, which gives emphasis on certain words.
Okay.
You can do it in a poem by breaking it up the line breaks, technically tell you where there's a pause. You can also do it with certain words that you emphasize. Some things have an obvious meter to them and some things don't. There's probably poetry older than the ancient Greeks, but that's the oldest real poetry that we know of. You can read some of the Sumerian things, and we've discussed Babylonian mythology. Some of the Inanna stories were almost undoubtedly the poetry of their era, but even though we can translate them, we can't really put them into meter.
Right.
Not very well. I suspect that poetry is as old as language itself. That as soon as human beings evolved to the state where they could communicate verbally, they began finding cool and clever ways to say things that would sound more interesting.
I can see that.
Yeah, and it goes hand in hand with storytelling, because stories can be very, very long. Rhyme and meter were vitally important in the days before writing had been invented, because all this is pre-literate. Things were done verbally long before anyone could write anything down. And if you use rhythm and rhyme, that helps you remember the piece. And more importantly, it helps it stick in the minds of the audience. Their minds are automatically drawn to that. And even after writing was invented, ancient Greece, of course, had their own alphabet. However, most people in your audience were illiterate. They couldn't just go out and buy a scroll with the latest, poem on it.
Right.
So in those days, poetry was very much a spoken word art. It wasn't considered a form of literature. It was spoken word. The pieces stick in your head when you hear a meter or a rhyme because we like patterns. Human beings are pattern-seeking animals. We all have our own internal rhythm. We have a heartbeat and we breathe. And that gives us two separate beats that we carry around with us all the time. And that resonates with us. When you find things that are similar to that or remind us of that, it triggers that dopamine button inside your brain. We recognize a pattern that's familiar to us. And that makes you happy. You spot that and you're naturally drawn to it. And that's the power that a good poem has. It can be done with rhymes. It can be done through alliteration. It can be done by breaking up the lines of something. A big question is what separates poetry from prose. Part of it is, again, the sense of rhythm to it. If you want to do communicate something about falling in love, you can write a paragraph. Or you can do a poem. And in a poem, you can emphasize certain things over the extent of other words. So if you do a good poem, you'll be able to tell the audience. If you're doing it out loud, you can certainly tell them which words are the most important. But even writing it down, you can emphasize certain things by where you put your line breaks and how you use the alliteration and so forth. So some people have said that a poem is prose with all the extra stuff squeezed out of it. Poetry is prose that's been condensed. You toss out all the extra words that you don't need and just leave the words that say exactly what you want to say, which is why it sounds more like it comes from the heart rather than from the head.
Makes sense.
Yeah, which doesn't mean that poetry doesn't have rules or a way of doing things. We can discuss that more next time. You can do free verse that has none of those things. But if you're just going to write something, there's no point in not writing it as prose, unless you have a specific reason why you want to make it a poem. Going through, you can take different sentences from great authors. Can you make a paragraph from someone into a poem? And sometimes you can, because some authors are like that. I tried to drag some examples here on camera, and I couldn't really find a lot of good examples. One of the two writers I immediately thought of were Fitzgerald and Hemingway. And I was thinking about trying to compare the two of them as poets, and I realized that Hemingway speaks a lot in dialogue. And dialogue is usually short and punchy. Hemingway was also famous as a prose writer for his short paragraphs. So he did punctuate what he wrote by lengthening his paragraphs the same way a poet would lengthen the lines that he wrote. And Fitzgerald wrote in an extremely evocative style. He would describe certain things at length and completely ignore other things. He spends a couple of paragraphs describing a billboard the narrator drives past on his way somewhere. He never describes the house the guy shows up at. So in a lot of ways, they're employing the techniques of poetry. So poetry and prose are very, very close together. Second cousins, so to speak, at least. Now, are songs poems?
I believe they are.
Yes, that's one thing I think almost everybody agrees on. A song is always a poem. It's not always a good poem, though.
Okay.
If you're doing a song and it's something set to music, then you have basically two tricks up your sleeve to catch an audience. You have words and you have music. And in a good song, the two of them work together. You can take the lyrics of a song and just read them, as sometimes they sound very flat and dry, and they're not powerful at all. But you hear those exact same words with music behind it, and it suddenly becomes incredibly moving. That's because it's the two things working together that make it succeed. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the lyrics of a good song just don't sound good at all when you just read them. Much the same way Shakespeare, although you can read Shakespeare, you actually need to see Shakespeare perform, because he didn't plan it anyway sitting around and studying his plays like texts. They're plays that are meant to be read by actors in front of an audience. So lyrics of songs are meant to be done with music. You can take a lot of poems and add music to them after the fact. And then you have something that stands both as like music and as words.
Right.
But if you separate the two, if you just read the lyrics of a song or just listen to the music of a song, like a karaoke with no words, it doesn't carry the same impact, of course. You know, there's plenty of instrumental pieces that have no words to them. They're not meant to have words. Beethoven could tell an entire story just with notes of music. It wasn't meant to have words. Mm-hmm. So that's a successful musical piece without words.
Absolutely.
So they can absolutely exist independently of each other. But a good song is words and music combined. Mm-hmm. Everything I've said goes double for rap music and hip hop, because those are literally like music stripped down to just the beat and the words, which are in some ways the most important things. And it's one of the reasons why hip hop songs are so infectious and catchy.
Right.
It's the beat is like everything in those pieces. And I also ask myself, can a speech be a poem?
I suppose it could.
It can. It absolutely can. With a speech, you don't have to break things up by lines. And a lot of great speeches we don't have recordings of, so we really don't know exactly how they were delivered. But many speeches, if you listen to them, they have a rhythm to them. They have a meter. Whether the person meant to impose that or not, I'm not certain. I spent so many years as a performance poet that I think I tend to give a certain rhythm to almost everything that I say.
Right.
Do you believe that's true, just off the top of your head?
I would think it probably is intentional, because as you're practicing it, it's going to come more smoothly, A, and B, it's going to be more, your audience will retain it better. I
think about what I'm going to say before I go in front of the camera, the same way I practice a poem before doing it in front of an audience, whereas I don't rehearse what I'm going to say when I go talk to you at your desk.
Right.
So when I rehearse something, I naturally try to decide what words to emphasize so the audience understand what I'm talking about. Some people will say that I'm a very good speaker or a good communicator are just subconsciously noticing the fact that I give a rhythm to what I say.
Right.
To emphasize the important things. You walk away listening to me knowing the most important things. If you listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, very, very famous speech. You've all heard it at some point. King comes from a background of being a Southern preacher. And so he has that sort of rolling rhythm to everything that he does. And having heard some other preachers from down south, that's a real style and a technique that he was very good at. If you listen to some of his other speeches, and many of them have been recorded, they're all kind of like that. Although that was his masterpiece. That was what had the most powerful statement and like the best rhythm to it of anything that he did. I've had the chance to perform that when I was in school in a class on speeches. I also did Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which is also a very famous speech. Reading the Gettysburg Address through a lens of poetry, right away I look at it and I'm thinking, 407 years ago our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Now, I don't actually think that Abraham Lincoln read it in a hip-hop style like I just did, but he might have. He was a man ahead of his time.
So you're able to find a rhythm where there maybe wasn't one intended to be there.
It probably wasn't intended to be a rhythm, but you notice what Abraham Lincoln did with those two lines. Did you notice everything?
Well, when you did it, but I wouldn't have if it was just
First of all,
straight.
he said 407 rather than 87.
Okay.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this. It doesn't work with 87. The rhythm is only there if you say 407.
That's interesting.
Also, the 4 in 4 gives you alliteration with our fathers brought forth.
I always assumed it was just a turn of phrase that was common in his time.
It might have been, but the fact that he uses 3 F's in 2 sentences, that's a lot of F's.
Yeah.
Alliteration, repeating letters, is a technique of meter.
Oh, that's too cool. Like, maybe it was intentional.
Yeah, and again, not in a hip-hop style necessarily, but the repetition of the letters makes it stick in your head.
True.
And it only works because he gives you enough syllables to do that with.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Humorously, I memorized this the first time I did it, and it was like decades and decades ago. And when I tried to do it in my head, I said to myself, our forefathers brought forth. And then I looked at what it actually said online, and he said fathers brought forth, which still gives you 3 F's rather than 4. But I instinctively wanted to put our forefathers rather than fathers, because I wanted more F's in that sentence to make it cooler. It still makes my point, but my subconscious immediately added an extra F in that sentence. Mm-hmm. You can break down the entire speech like that if you feel like it. Good
Does
orators.
it follow?
Basically, yeah. Good speakers have always noticed things like that, and I'm sure there were oratory classes you could take in college in those days. Whether Lincoln took any or not, I seriously doubt. But people who are effective speakers can do things like that.
Do we know that it was him personally who wrote it?
Yes, almost certainly.
Okay.
The legend is he wrote it in the back of an envelope while he was going to Gettysburg to make the speech, which is probably not actually true, but it's close to being true.
I will never feel bad for procrastinating ever again.
It was a tough time for Lincoln, and he knew the speech at Gettysburg, it was coming at a really crucial time in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Gettysburg was a horrific, bloody mess of a battle, which, his side won, but, asking whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. He's asking whether we could actually survive the Civil War. Is it going to be United States of America after it's done?
Right.
No matter who wins, is there going to be a country left?
Right.
Supposedly at the time, he didn't consider that his greatest speech. But considering how short it is, and when he was doing the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he would talk for 2 hours at a time.
Wow.
So this is a man who could really love to talk. But the Gettysburg Address, he deliberately kept it short and not completely sweet. It's a very bittersweet speech, indicating, I feel, the weight of responsibility he felt on his shoulders in the middle of this battle.
Right.
Or in the middle of the war that was still going on. The battle had ended, but not the war.
Yeah. Heed the warning.
Yeah, exactly. So I find poetry almost everywhere.
Yeah.
And partly it's because I've been trained as a poet, but I think I don't want to disrespect teachers in any way, but I think in school, teachers sometimes teach the forms of poetry, iambic pentameter and haiku and all the different styles of poetry, which is great. Learning to write in those different styles is wonderful, and it gives you new ways to express yourself. But in a lot of ways, that's not what poetry is about.
Well, you can't miss the heart of it.
Yeah. So teaching structure rather than the spirit of something is a good way to get kids really bored.
Yeah.
I got involved in a poetry group when I was in Providence, and I discovered that there's other poetry groups meeting in several different places, and I got involved in slam poetry, which was competitive performance poetry, which is a really intense, brutally creative endeavor. And I discovered that poetry is a living art form. If you'd asked me 30 years ago about poetry, I had poems that I really liked. I liked poetry. But I didn't consider it to be anything that was important to the world. And now I realize poetry is extremely important, and it's everywhere. One of my favorite quotes from Jill McMillan is, someone asked, who's your favorite, dead poet? She says, my favorite dead poets are still alive.
There you go.
Because there's so much good work being done all the time in poetry. So we'll talk a little bit next time about how to write a poem and the structure of different poems. We will still discuss, even though I never use them. Everything I do is basically free verse, but I almost always have some kind of a meter or rhythm to them, whether I intend to or not. As a performance poet, when I write a poem or type it, I put in line breaks where I can take a breath, so I can adjust my breathing to the beat of the poem.
It's like cooking. You just listen to the ancestors.
All right, so we'll get even deeper into poetry next time. Until then, I have been Ed.
And Solitaire.
See you next time. Until then, be safe.